Imagine yourself in the ancient world, long before the noise of empires or the clash of armies. Picture a landscape dotted with small villages, fertile vineyards, and quiet groves. Among these humble beginnings, a figure emerges: Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, festivity, and the peculiar balance between chaos and order. But before Dionysus became the flamboyant deity you might imagine, his story begins with something far more grounded and, frankly, a bit tedious. Dionysus, unlike other Olympian gods, born in the grandeur of Mount Olympus, has an origin steeped in human vulnerability and natural mystery. According to tradition, he was the son of Zeus and Semele, a mortal woman. This mix of divine and mortal blood set the stage for a series of journeys that were less about epic battles and more about survival, wandering, and the slow invention of something that would change human society forever. Wine. The myth tells us that Semele was tricked by Hera, Zeus's jealous wife, into demanding that Zeus reveal himself in his true form. Unable to resist, Zeus did so, and the mortal woman was incinerated by the divine radiance. But from this tragedy, Zeus rescued the unborn Dionysus, sewing him into his thigh until he was ready to be born. This strange birth reflects a world in which boundaries between life and death, divine and mortal, were porous and fluid. After his birth, the young god was hidden away in remote places, mountains, forests, and secret caves, places far from human civilization. These wanderings were not glamorous. They were filled with the slow, often dull task of learning survival in a world that was less about heroism and more about endurance. This is the first significant detail often lost in the popular tales. Dionysus did not simply appear fully formed and powerful. He was a child of nature, a god who learned from the earth, the plants, and the people who cultivated the land. The connection between Dionysus and wine is more than just mythological flourish. In reality, wine was one of the first fermented beverages created by humans, and it emerged not out of celebration but necessity. Early humans discovered fermentation as a way to preserve grapes beyond the growing season. Wine's intoxicating effects were a curious byproduct rather than the primary goal. The slow experimentation with fermenting grapes marked a turning point in human interaction with nature. This connection reflects in Dionysus's own story. His travels through the Mediterranean were, in many ways, the slow spread of grapes and making wine from region to region. Each community he visited learned how to cultivate vineyards, harvest grapes, and ferment them into wine. But this was not a simple or fast process. It involved careful observation of seasons, trial and error in storage methods, and a gradual understanding of the natural cycles that made wine possible. Imagine the dull reality of this task: waiting for grapes to ripen, carefully pruning vines, watching weather patterns, and experimenting with fermentation jars. These were the details that shaped the ancient wine culture. Dionysus's story is, in part, a reflection of this tedious but essential labor. Moreover, the gods getting lost can be seen both literally and metaphorically. His myth recounts multiple episodes where he disappears into wildernesses or foreign lands, often accompanied by followers who were less gods and more human-like satyrs, maenads, and other rustic creatures. This wandering was less about conquest and more about survival and adaptation. He was a deity who learned through trial patience, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. Dionysus's slow progress mirrors the reality of how wine itself was a sudden spark of genius, but a gradual cultural development across centuries. Early winemakers faced many challenges: how to protect wine from spoiling, how to store it safely, and how to use it socially in ways that brought communities together rather than tearing them apart. The gods' narrative preserves this slow, human story beneath the mythic veneer. The social impact of wine also began quietly. In these early times, wine was not the ubiquitous, celebratory drink it would later become. It was a luxury and a tool. It helped preserve food calories, allowed for safer hydration when water was suspect, and sometimes played a role in religious rituals. The slow diffusion of wine culture shaped ancient societies, influencing agriculture, trade, and social structures. Yet, despite the significance of this development, it was surrounded by mundane difficulties: vineyards lost to frost, barrels that leaked, wine that turned sour before it could be consumed. These aspects of Dionysus's story rarely capture the spotlight, but they speak to the resilience of human innovation. They remind us that history is not just about spectacular events, but the patient, repetitive work behind them. In the midst of this slow emergence, the figure of Dionysus took on a dual identity: a god who could bring both joy and madness, life and death, order and chaos. This ambivalence reflects the unpredictable nature of wine itself, a beverage that can nourish or destroy, bond or separate communities. As we trace the beginnings of Dionysus's journey and the early invention of wine, a question lingers. How did this slow, often overlooked process of survival and cultural innovation shape not only the god's myth, but also the everyday lives of ancient people? What can we learn from the tedious details of his wanderings and the gradual mastery of winemaking? And perhaps most intriguingly, why does a god known for festivity start his story in such obscurity and survival, wandering, lost in wilderness, before the first sip of wine was ever raised in celebration? Now that you've seen how Dionysus was born into obscurity and began as a god entwined with the slow, arduous invention of wine, let's turn to the next phase of his journey: his wandering across lands and peoples, spreading viticulture and carving a place for wine and himself in ancient culture. Dionysus's wanderings were far from the glamorous conquests of other Olympians. Instead, they resembled long migrations filled with dull challenges, cultural exchanges, and survival in unfamiliar environments. His travels took him through mountains, forests, and islands, places where agriculture was difficult and human settlements sparse. One key region in this story is Phrygia, in what is now modern Turkey. According to the myth, Dionysus spent significant time here, learning from local cultures how to cultivate vines suited to different soils and climates. This was a slow and sometimes frustrating process. Each new environment presented new variables: temperature shifts, soil acidity, pests, and unpredictable weather patterns. It took repeated attempts to identify which grape varieties thrived, how to protect crops from birds and insects, and how to store harvested grapes to begin fermentation. Imagine the monotonous cycle of seasons: planting in spring, nurturing the vines through dry summers, harvesting in late autumn, and then hoping the winter frost would not destroy the fragile roots. The gods' followers, often depicted as rustic satyrs and wild maenads, were actually symbolic representations of the human laborers and farmers who performed this backbreaking work. Winemaking in these early days was not simply about pleasure, it was about survival. Fermentation helped preserve the fruit's calories in a portable, safer form, vital in times when food scarcity was common. Moreover, wine diluted with water became a safer alternative to often contaminated drinking water sources. The slow cultural diffusion of wine accompanied Dionysus's mythic travels. He was said to have introduced viticulture to the Greeks after bringing it from the East. This transfer, while mythologized as divine gift, mirrors the real diffusion of agriculture across ancient civilizations. Yet this diffusion was anything but straightforward. Different cultures had varying relationships with fermented beverages. Some preferred beer-like drinks. Others hesitated to adopt grape wine due to unfamiliarity or religious taboos. Dionysus's story encodes these tensions. The god was often depicted as both welcomed and resisted, an outsider who unsettled traditional social orders. The god's entourage also reflects this complexity. His followers were not just mythical creatures. They symbolize marginalized groups, wandering tribes, foreigners, and women participating in rituals outside the male-dominated religious hierarchy. The Bacchae, or maenads, who danced wildly in his honor, represent the subversion of social norms that often accompanied wine's introduction. Their ecstatic rites were simultaneously feared and revered, revealing ancient society's ambivalence about intoxication's social effects. Behind the mythology lies the reality of social adaptation. Early wine consumption needed new customs, festivals, and taboos. Communities negotiated how to incorporate wine into their rituals without losing social cohesion. This process was slow and fraught with misunderstandings, just like Dionysus's own complicated reception. Trade was a significant factor in this spread. As wine became more valued, it grew into a commodity transported over increasing distances. Amphora-large ceramic vessels carried wine across the Mediterranean, connecting disparate cultures through commerce. But transporting wine was a precarious business. Amphorae often cracked. Spoilage was common. Merchants and producers had to develop new techniques for sealing and storing wine, again reflecting a long chain of dull, incremental improvements. In these early days, wine also became entwined with religious ritual beyond Dionysian cults. Greeks and later Romans integrated wine into sacrifices and communal meals, where it symbolized both divine favor and human fellowship. This ritualization helped stabilize wine's place in society, turning it from a risky novelty into a cultural cornerstone. But the god's journey was not free of hardship or loss. Dionysus's myths frequently recount episodes of conflict, betrayed by followers, or even torn apart and reborn. These cycles of death and renewal mirror the unpredictability of wine production and the social instability surrounding its acceptance. You might think that by this stage, the god and his invention had settled into a comfortable place in Greek life. Yet, the question remains, how did societies manage the dual nature of wine, its ability to bring joy and chaos in everyday life? How did ordinary people reconcile the god's wild, disruptive aspects with the practical benefits of viticulture and fermentation? Furthermore, What does this slow, tangled process tell us about human resilience and the ways culture evolves through persistence, adaptation, and sometimes reluctant acceptance? By now, you've traveled with Dionysus from his unusual birth through the slow, patient invention of wine and the gods' wandering spread of viticulture and ritual. In this final section, we'll explore how Dionysus's story reflects the broader impact of wine on ancient societies, how this seemingly boring cultural development shaped human history in enduring ways. The figure of Dionysus remained ambivalent in Greek thought, a god of revelry and madness, yet also a symbol of survival, innovation, and social connection. His myth captures the complex nature of wine itself, both its practical utility and its potential for disorder. In everyday ancient life, wine was a fundamental part of survival strategies. It provided calories, safer hydration, and social cohesion. In the context of limited food preservation technologies, fermenting grapes offered a reliable way to store nutrients beyond the harvest. This was crucial in times when food shortages could threaten entire communities. Dionysus's gift was not just the intoxicating drink, but the slow, painstaking knowledge of how to cultivate vines and transform grapes into a lasting resource. This knowledge passed from generation to generation, carried by farmers whose names and stories are largely lost to history. Their daily toil pruning, harvesting, storing made wine production possible. These details, often overlooked, formed the backbone of ancient agricultural economies. Moreover, wine's integration into ritual and social life created new cultural norms and institutions. The symposium-organized drinking party in classical Greece was not merely a place for intoxication, but a structured forum for conversation, political debate, and philosophical reflection. The god Dionysus, with his wild followers, was both the inspiration and the warning for such gatherings. Wine could enhance human connection or lead to chaos. This duality speaks to a universal human challenge, managing the benefits and risks of new technologies or cultural practices. The slow acceptance of wine and the balancing act, communities performed echoes in many historical innovations, medicine, agriculture, or even communication systems. Trade in wine also stimulated broader economic and cultural exchanges. Amphorae carrying wine have been found across the Mediterranean, testifying to a network of commerce that connected distant peoples. These trade routes helped disseminate not only goods, but ideas, practices, and technologies, contributing to the rich tapestry of ancient civilizations. Dionysus's mythic getting lost is emblematic of the unpredictable paths cultural innovations take. The gods' wanderings, challenges, and eventual acceptance mirror the real human processes of trial, error, and adaptation that define history. What seems chaotic or marginal at first, like a wandering god or a new agricultural technique, can become central to social life through perseverance. Finally, consider the modern legacy of Dionysus and wine. Despite millennia of technological and social change, wine remains both a symbol of celebration and a reminder of human frailty. Its power to connect or disrupt communities continues to inspire caution and reverence. The story of Dionysus invites you to reflect on how the boring details of history, the slow cultivation of a crop, the steady improvement of storage, methods, the negotiation of social rituals, shaped the world far more profoundly than sudden events or dramatic heroes. So, as you rest and let your thoughts drift, consider this. How many other lost gods and slow inventions in history have quietly transformed human survival and society? And how might paying attention to these unglamorous stories change the way you view the past and even the present? Imagine the vastness of the Roman Empire at its height, stretching across continents, encompassing diverse peoples and terrains. You might picture triumphant legions, grand cities, and monumental architecture, but underneath this grandeur lay the crucial machinery that kept the empire functioning, the cursus publicus, Rome's state postal and courier service. This system was not born overnight. It evolved slowly, reflecting Rome's expanding administrative needs and the practical challenges of managing an empire without modern technology. While its origins might seem dull, a network of roads, relay stations, and horses, the cursus publicus was a marvel of logistical persistence, a backbone that allowed Rome to survive as a political entity for centuries. The Roman postal system began as a tool for the emperor and senior officials to communicate across vast distances. Unlike today's instant messages, sending an imperial order required careful planning and countless hours of travel by horseback or carriage. The roads, famously engineered but still subject to weather and wear, were the arteries that kept this communication alive. Relay stations, called mutations for horse changes and mansionese for rest stops, were spaced along these roads approximately every 10 to 15 miles. These stops allowed couriers to exchange tired horses for fresh ones and, if needed, rest before continuing. Though designed for speed, these stations depended on constant maintenance and local cooperation. The reality was often slow and tedious roads needed repairs, horses had to be fed, and relay stations managed their supplies carefully. Imperial documents and messages were carried by specially authorized couriers, known as cursorus. These messengers were granted privileges, such as exemptions from local taxes and the right to requisition horses and supplies. Yet, even with these privileges, the system was vulnerable. Weather delays, theft, and bureaucratic obstacles were common. The postal system's slow development mirrored the growth of the empire itself. Initially, it was a simple network focused on the Italian peninsula. But as Rome expanded into Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, and the Near East, the cursus publicus extended its recolbiate unevenly. Notably, the system was tightly controlled by the central government. Access was limited. Ordinary citizens could rarely send personal mail through the official routes. Instead, merchants, local officials, and military commanders depended on the system for vital correspondence. The cursus publicus, therefore, was both an administrative tool and a symbol of imperial authority. Maintaining the system required immense resources. Relay stations needed personnel and animals. Roads required constant upkeep, and local communities often bore the burden of supplying horses or labor. This created tensions, as the demands of the imperial postal service sometimes clashed with local economies and priorities. Despite these challenges, the cursus publicus was effective for centuries, enabling emperors to issue decrees, generals to receive orders, and governors to coordinate distant provinces. It was a slow, grinding machine, but it was essential. However, By the 3rd century CE, signs of strain began to appear. Increasing political instability, economic troubles, and military pressures stretched the empire's resources thin. The once reliable postal system started to falter under these pressures. The question that lingers at this point is, how did a system so vital to Rome's power begin to unravel, and what were the slow, boring details of its decline? What can the slow decay of the cursus publicus teach us about the fragility of even the most impressive human institutions? By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire faced mounting difficulties. Political instability, economic decline, and increasing external threats combined to place enormous pressure on all aspects of imperial administration, including the once efficient cursus publicus. Initially, the postal system had functioned smoothly, supported by a relatively stable bureaucracy and well-maintained infrastructure. But the reality of the empire's size meant constant upkeep was necessary. Roads needed repair after storms and wear. Horses required regular feeding and replacement, and relay stations depended on local support. The slow, tedious maintenance of these basics became harder to sustain as the empire's fortunes waned. One of the primary challenges was funding. The cursus publicus was financed through the imperial treasury, but relied heavily on local communities for horses, labor, and supplies. These requisitions were often resented, especially as local economies struggled with heavy taxation and resource shortages. Over time, communities resisted these demands, either reducing support or openly ignoring courier requests. With the empire under pressure from invading tribes and internal revolts, resources were diverted to military needs. Roads, once prioritized for postal use, became battle-damaged and less reliable. The relay stations, often small and scattered outposts, suffered from neglect or destruction. The loss of these critical nodes slowed communication considerably. Bureaucratic corruption and inefficiency also played a role. Some officials, entrusted with managing postal routes, exploited the system for personal gain, delaying messages, embezzling funds, or demanding bribes for services. Such issues eroded trust in the system and created bottlenecks. Additionally, the sheer geographic scale of the empire became a liability. Communication from Rome to distant provinces like Britain or Egypt took weeks, if not months, even under the best circumstances. As threats increased, the slow postal system struggled to keep pace with rapidly changing military and political situations. The Emperor Diocletian attempted reforms around the late 3rd century, dividing the empire into smaller administrative units and improving infrastructure. While these efforts temporarily stabilized some routes, they could not reverse the long-term decline. The postal network became increasingly regionalized. Instead of a unified system, provincial services operated independently with varying reliability. The fragmentation of the postal service mirrored the empire's gradual fragmentation itself. As central control weakened, local rulers and military commanders relied more on their own communication networks, bypassing the imperial cursus publicus. This shift further undermined the system's coherence. Throughout this period, ordinary people rarely used the official postal system. Instead, merchants, travelers, and officials depended on informal networks or local messengers who were slower and less secure but more flexible. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in the late 5th century, The cursus publicus had largely ceased to function as a centralized network. Roads remained, and horses still carried messages, but the imperial infrastructure and administrative oversight that had sustained the system were gone. This slow, grinding decline invites reflection. How do complex systems built over centuries falter, not because of a single catastrophic event, but through a multitude of small, seemingly boring failures? How did the everyday struggles of maintaining horses, roads, and relay stations contribute to the fall of one of history's greatest empires? And importantly, what does this tell us about our own reliance on complex infrastructure today? As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the late 5th century CE, the cursus publicus, once a marvel of administrative efficiency, had quietly faded into obscurity. What remains, however, is a story rich with lessons about the resilience and fragility of complex human systems. The Postal Service's decline was not marked by a single dramatic failure, but by countless small issues: neglected roads, exhausted horses, resented local communities, and corrupt officials. These boring details, repeated over decades and centuries, chipped away at a system that had once seemed indispensable. Interestingly, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, maintained a version of the postal service for longer, adapting to new circumstances, but never fully restoring the old system's reach. The reliance on horses, relay stations, and imperial control persisted, but the scale and coordination diminished. What stands out is how the postal system embodied the interconnectedness of political, economic, and social factors. Without steady funding, local cooperation, and a stable government, even the best engineered networks can falter. The system's failure was as much about human relationships and daily labor as it was about infrastructure. For the people of late antiquity, this decline meant slower communication, delayed orders, and fragmented governance. Military commanders faced difficulties receiving timely instructions. Provincial governors struggled to manage resources effectively. The resulting uncertainty contributed to the empire's political and military vulnerability. From a broader perspective, the Postal Service's long decay reminds us that history often unfolds through gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. The fall of Rome wasn't just armies at the gates, but also the slow unraveling of countless logistical threads holding society together. In modern times, we depend on vast communication networks, from postal systems to the internet, that seem almost invisible, but are vital. Reflecting on Rome's cursus publicus invites a deeper appreciation for these everyday infrastructures and a recognition of how their slow failures could profoundly disrupt society. So, as you drift toward sleep, consider this: how do the boring details of maintenance, cooperation, and persistence quietly sustain the grand narratives of human history? And how might paying attention to these details change the way we understand both the past and our present? By the early 7th century, the Tang dynasty ruled over what was arguably the largest and most populous empire in the world. Managing such an immense territory was a colossal challenge, especially when it came to understanding exactly who lived there, where, and how to tax and govern them effectively. This brings us to one of the dullest but most significant aspects of Tang administration: the imperial census. Unlike modern censuses, the Tang census was not a simple head count done every 10 years. Instead, it was a continuous, painstaking process involving local officials, village elders, and bureaucrats across provinces and counties. The goal was to maintain an up-to-date register of the empire's population, households, land holdings, and taxable assets, fundamental tool for state control, tax collection, and military conscription. At first glance, census taking sounds boring. Officials knocking on doors, recording names and ages, tallying fields and animals. Yet, behind this monotonous activity lay a complex web of social negotiation, local power dynamics, and survival strategies. The census was not just about numbers. It shaped the lives of millions and influenced everything from labor demands to famine relief. The Thames census bureaucracy was vast. Local magistrates supervised teams of clerks and census-takers who had to navigate challenging terrain and sometimes uncooperative villagers. Accuracy was difficult. People might hide family members to avoid taxes or conscription, exaggerate property to gain status, or simply be missed due to remote location or nomadic lifestyles. Furthermore, political incentives complicated the process. Officials were often evaluated based on their ability to meet population targets and revenue quotas. This pressure led to underreporting or falsification of data, skewing the official records. Despite these problems, the census system reflected the Tang dynasty's broader emphasis on bureaucratic control and record-keeping. The empire's reliance on Confucian principles prioritized orderly administration and merit-based governance. The census was a cornerstone of this ideology and expression of the state's reach into the most private corners of its subjects' lives. Maintaining the census also required sustained resources, manpower, training, transportation of records, and enforcement. Local officials had to reconcile imperial demands with the realities of everyday life, sometimes adapting procedures to local customs or negotiating exemptions for hardship cases. By the mid-Tang period, the census data shaped significant policy decisions, such as the allocation of tax burdens and the recruitment of soldiers. It also exposed the tensions within the empire between central authority and local autonomy, between bureaucrats and peasants, and between official records and lived realities. But this slow, bureaucratic process was not static. It evolved over time in response to population movements, economic shifts, and political pressures. The census system was a living institution, continuously adjusted in small, often tedious, increments to meet the empire's changing needs. As you consider the endless, detailed work of census officials trudging through villages, mountains, and plains, you might ask, how did such a vast empire manage to keep track of its people with such imperfect tools? What were the consequences of the census's inaccuracies for governance and society? And how does this slow grind of paperwork and record-keeping compare with modern data collection? As the Temps census apparatus rolled forward, local officials found themselves at the intersection of imperial expectations and the complicated realities of the empire's diverse population. The task of enumerating millions across vast, varied landscapes, mountains, rivers, nomadic frontiers, and sprawling cities was no small feat. The imperial government expected precise, up-to-date information. Census data determined tax liabilities, corvée labor quotas, and military conscription, key elements for sustaining Temps governance and defense. Yet, the process was vulnerable to human factors that complicated its effectiveness. Villagers and families often had incentives to conceal or manipulate census data. For example, families might hide young men to avoid military service or underreport the number of children to reduce tax burdens. Landowners sometimes attempted to hide property or transfer it unofficially to others to evade taxes. These behaviors made accuracy elusive and introduced a layer of social negotiation into what seemed like a simple bureaucratic task. Local officials were caught in a difficult position. They were tasked with delivering accurate reports, but depended on the cooperation of local elites and common people who might resist or circumvent census procedures. Furthermore, officials themselves were subject to quotas and evaluations that sometimes encouraged falsification or underreporting to meet targets or avoid scrutiny. The imperial administration recognized these challenges and implemented measures to improve the census's reliability. These included spot checks, cross-referencing with tax records, and incentives for honest reporting. Yet these reforms were costly and never completely effective. The census also had to account for population movements. Wars, famines, and migrations continually reshaped demographics. The An Lushan Rebellion, a major upheaval in the mid-8th century, caused widespread displacement and chaos, making census taking near impossible in affected regions. Refugees moved en masse, records were lost, and entire counties saw their populations vanish or swell unpredictably. Meanwhile, nomadic peoples on the empire's borders presented another challenge. Many did not fit neatly into the sedentary agricultural census model, complicating efforts to count and tax them. Some were incorporated as military colonies, while others remained outside imperial control. The bureaucratic apparatus also expanded the census scope over time, tracking more than just population. Officials recorded land ownership, crop yields, livestock numbers, and even the availability of household labor. This breadth of data collection reflected the Tang government's ambition to understand and control its resources fully. The census process, therefore, was a constant negotiation between rigid imperial frameworks and the fluid, sometimes chaotic social realities on the ground. Each year's data represented not just a count, but a snapshot of the empire's ongoing struggles with governance, control, and adaptation. By the late Thames period, the cumulative effects of population shifts, administrative strain, and political instability eroded the census's effectiveness. Official records often failed to match the lived realities of the empire's people, undermining the government's capacity to govern efficiently. Looking at this slow, complex process, you might wonder, how did the endless bureaucracy of the Tang census influence the empire's stability? Could a better understanding or reform of such administrative systems have altered history's course? And what does this tell us about the delicate balance between state control and social reality? The Tang dynasty's census was more than a mere counting of heads. It was a reflection of the dynasty's ambitions and challenges in governing one of history's most expansive empires. Yet, as the dynasty moved into its later centuries, the imperfections and limitations of the census system became increasingly apparent. By the 9th century, political unrest, economic difficulties, and natural disasters had deeply unsettled the Tang state. Census data, once a pillar of imperial authority, grew increasingly unreliable. Records failed to keep pace with rapid population movements, social upheavals, and widespread corruption. These inaccuracies had profound consequences. Tax revenues fluctuated unpredictably, undermining the government's financial stability. Military conscription faltered as officials struggled to identify eligible recruits. Local elites exploited weaknesses in the system to avoid obligations, exacerbating social inequalities. The erosion of the census system reflected a broader weakening of bureaucratic control. The dynasty's grip on its provinces loosened, contributing to the eventual fragmentation of imperial authority and the dynasty's decline in the late 9th century. Despite these challenges, the legacy of the Tang census endures. It set a precedent for meticulous state record-keeping and centralized governance that influenced subsequent Chinese dynasties for centuries. The emphasis on data collection, administrative hierarchy, and the balance between local and central control became defining features of Chinese imperial administration. Moreover, the Thames experience highlights the human dimension behind bureaucratic systems, the tedious, often overlooked work of census officials, the daily negotiations between rulers and ruled, and the gradual adaptations to changing realities. In reflecting on the endless bureaucracy of the Tang census, consider the modern parallels. Today's governments rely heavily on data censuses, surveys, statistics to govern vast populations and allocate resources. Yet the challenges remain familiar. Inaccuracies, local resistance, political pressures, and the complex dance between centralized authority and local conditions. As you settle into rest, ponder this: how much of our modern world depends on similarly boring but essential systems of record-keeping and administration? And what might the slow, persistent work of countless officials, clerks, and ordinary people throughout history teach us about the fragility and resilience of human societies? When you think of the Great Wall of China, you might imagine a vast. What is often forgotten, however, are the long, slow, and exhausting decades of labor that went into building its earliest sections, work that was as much a test of human endurance as a feat of engineering. The Great Wall, as it exists today, is actually a series of walls and fortifications built, rebuilt, and extended over many centuries by different dynasties. But the foundations of this monumental endeavor were laid in the centuries before the famous Ming Dynasty walls, particularly during the Qin 221 to 206 BCE and Han 206 BCE to 220 CE dynasty. Before Qin Shi Huang, China was divided into warring states, many of which had constructed smaller walls for defense. When Qin Shi Huang unified these states, he initiated the ambitious project of connecting and extending these walls into a cohesive barrier against northern nomadic tribes. The construction process was painstakingly slow and physically grueling. Workers, often conscripted peasants, prisoners, and soldiers, faced harsh conditions. The labor involved hauling heavy stones and earth, mixing mortar, and building on difficult terrain, including steep mountain ridges and arid deserts. The logistics of supplying food, tools, and materials across remote regions added another layer of complexity. Roads were poor or non-existent, and construction sites were often far from settlements. Many workers suffered from malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease. Local economies were burdened by the massive demands of the project. Villages were taxed heavily, not only in goods and money, but also in manpower. Resistance to conscription and labor requisitions sometimes flared, creating tensions between imperial officials and local populations. Despite these difficulties, the early walls served important strategic and symbolic functions. They acted as physical barriers, slowing invasions and controlling trade routes. They also demonstrated imperial authority and the state's capacity to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. The early Great Wall was not a single continuous wall, but a patchwork of fortifications, earthen mounds, stone walls, watchtowers, and signal fires built and maintained by regional armies and officials. This fragmentation reflected the challenges of communication and coordination in a vast empire. Interestingly, the wall's defensive utility was often limited. Nomadic tribes adapted their strategies, exploiting gaps and weaknesses in the wall. The psychological effect of the wall, however, as a symbol of unity and strength, arguably mattered as much as its physical presence. As you consider the centuries-long toil behind the wall's foundations, you might ask, what motivated the empire to undertake such a colossal project despite its hardships and limited military success? How did the daily lives of laborers and local communities shape this historical monument? And what does the wall's slow construction tell us about the relationship between power, infrastructure, and human endurance? Building the early Great Wall was an exercise in endurance, not just for the empire, but especially for the countless laborers who toiled daily to raise this monumental structure. These workers were drawn from the most vulnerable segments of society: peasants conscripted from villages, prisoners sentenced to hard labor, and soldiers assigned to construction duties during peacetime. The daily life of these workers was harsh and monotonous. They faced long hours of strenuous manual labor, moving earth, cutting stone, and erecting walls, often in extreme weather conditions. Summers brought scorching heat in the deserts. Winters exposed workers to biting cold atop mountain ridges. Shelter was minimal, food rations meager, and medical care almost non-existent. Many workers succumbed to exhaustion, accidents, and disease. Historical records from later dynasties, which echoed earlier accounts, describe the deaths of tens of thousands during construction phases. These losses were often accepted as the cost of state projects, but they left deep scars on local communities, which sometimes found entire generations missing or weakened. The conscription system placed an immense strain on villages, leaving behind women, children, and the elderly to manage farms and households. This labor drain could reduce agricultural productivity, leading to food shortages and economic hardship. The logistical challenges were equally daunting. Supplying remote construction sites required intricate planning. Imperial officials coordinated the transport of food, tools, and building materials, often over rough terrain with limited infrastructure. Caravans and pack animals carried loads through narrow mountain passes and across deserts. Roads and temporary camps were built alongside the wall to facilitate movement and coordination. Supply chains depended heavily on local resources, forcing officials to requisition grain and timber from surrounding areas, adding further pressure on local populations. The wall's patchwork nature also created challenges. Different sections were built under varying regional authorities, each with their own methods, materials, and priorities. This decentralization sometimes led to uneven quality and gaps in the fortifications, undermining the wall's defensive purpose. Yet, amid this grueling labor and logistical complexity, the wall project fostered a complex social dynamic. For some workers, especially soldiers, the construction was a duty tied to imperial service and honor. For others, it was a harsh punishment or a desperate means of survival. The wall's early construction also reflected the political will of the Qin and Han emperors to assert control over vast territories and defend against persistent threats from northern nomads like the Jiannu. The decision to invest enormous human and material resources, even with questionable military returns, demonstrates the intertwining of power, symbolism, and infrastructure in imperial China. As you reflect on the human toil behind the walls, slow construction, could the monumental effort have been achieved without such immense human cost? And what do these realities reveal about the nature of state power and the sacrifices it demands? As the early sections of the Great Wall gradually took shape under the Qin and Han dynasties, their physical presence remained only one part of the wall's significance. Beyond stones and earth, the wall embodied the ambitions, struggles, and sacrifices of a vast empire trying to hold itself together. The monumental project was never truly finished. Instead, it was a continuous process of building, repairing, and extending, responding to shifting political landscapes, military threats, and technological capabilities. Later dynasties, especially the Ming, would invest even greater effort and resources, but the foundations laid during the early centuries set the tone for the empire's rulers. The wall was a statement of imperial authority, visible reminder that the state could mobilize vast human and material resources for defense and control. The symbolic weight of this message often outweighed its immediate military effectiveness. The wall was as much about showing power as it was about exerting it. For the laborers and local communities, however, the wall was a source of hardship and disruption. The slow, exhausting construction claimed countless lives and altered landscapes, economies, and social structures. Villages lost their able-bodied men, fields went untended, resources were diverted. Yet these sacrifices were rarely acknowledged in official histories, overshadowed by the grandeur of the monument. The wall's mixed legacy endures today. It stands as a marvel of ancient engineering and a potent symbol of China's historical resilience and unity. Yet it also serves as a reminder of the human cost of empire, the grinding labor, the endurance of ordinary people, and the complexities hidden behind the imposing stones. Reflecting on the wall's slow, grueling construction invites a broader contemplation of how monumental infrastructure projects shape societies. They require not just engineering skill, but social coordination, political will, and often the endurance of people whose stories rarely make it into history books. As you rest, consider this. How do the monumental projects of past empires compare to the infrastructure endeavors of today? What lessons lie hidden in the quiet struggles of those who built and sustained these structures? And how might the slow, steady toil behind such projects shape the course of history in ways we often overlook? In medieval Europe, far from the grand battles and royal intrigues that dominate popular imagination, a different kind of history was quietly being recorded. The meticulous manorial rolls These detailed records, maintained by local lords and stewards, chronicled the everyday workings of feudal estates, the manners that formed the backbone of European rural life. Manorial rolls were exhaustive in scope. They documented everything from land holdings, tenant obligations, and crop yields, to livestock inventories, labor services, and even fines or disputes. These records were essential tools for managing the estate's resources and ensuring that the lord's rights and revenues were upheld. The production of these rolls was a slow, repetitive process. Scribes or bailiffs would conduct surveys and inspections, often at regular intervals, such as annually or at harvest time. They carefully noted who lived where, what land they cultivated, how much labor they owed, and what payments or produce they delivered. Although these documents might appear tedious, they offer a fascinating window into the lives of ordinary people, peasants, serfs, artisans whose experiences rarely made it into the chronicles of kings and knights. Through the rolls, we glimpse the rhythms of medieval rural existence, the cycles of planting and harvesting, the obligations of tenants, and the occasional disputes over boundaries or services. The rolls also reveal the complexity and variation within feudal society. Not all peasants were serfs. Some held free tenure, while others rented land or worked as wage laborers. Manorial customs differed from region to region, and the rolls reflect these local distinctions with painstaking detail. Administratively, the manorial rolls were vital for maintaining the lord's authority and ensuring economic stability. They formed the basis for taxation, labor extraction, and dispute resolution. Their accuracy was crucial. Errors could lead to lost revenue or legal challenges. Over time, these records accumulated into vast archives, forming a continuous historical record of rural life that spans centuries. Historians today rely on surviving manorial rolls to reconstruct social and economic conditions, understanding patterns of settlement, agricultural practices, and demographic change. Yet the process of creating and maintaining these rolls was not without challenges. Scribes faced the difficulty of verifying information in dispersed and often isolated communities. Tenants might hide property or labor to reduce obligations, and disputes sometimes arose over the accuracy of entries. Moreover, the slow pace and bureaucratic nature of record-keeping meant that the rolls often lagged behind reality. Changes in tenancy, land use, or population might not be promptly reflected, leading to tensions between lords and tenants. As you reflect on these exhaustive but quiet records, you might wonder, how did the manorial system's reliance on such detailed bureaucracy affect the lives of those bound within it? In what ways did these slow, methodical records help sustain or transform medieval rural society? And what do these dusty rolls tell us about the interplay between power, economy, and everyday life? The manorial rolls were much more than mere ledgers. They were the beating heart of feudal administration at the local level. Behind every carefully penned entry lay an intricate system of social relations, economic transactions, and legal frameworks that defined medieval rural life. Maintaining these records required a dedicated bureaucracy. The steward or bailiff of the manor, often a middle-ranking official, was responsible for overseeing the estate's day-to-day operations and ensuring that the rolls accurately reflected the manor's status. He coordinated surveys, collected rents, supervised labor services, and settled disputeful duties that demanded both administrative skill and local knowledge. The process of record-keeping began with the manorial court, a regular assembly where tenants gathered to discuss estate affairs, resolve conflicts, and update tenure agreements. Court sessions were often the moments when new data was collected, such as changes in land tenure or labor obligations, which were then entered into the rolls. These courts functioned as microcosms of feudal governance. Tenants had to be present or represented, and their rights and duties were reaffirmed. The steward's detailed notes from these sessions formed the backbone of the manorial rolls. Yet, this system was vulnerable to manipulation and dispute. Tenants might contest their obligations or challenge the steward's authority. Some would hide resources, delay payments, or resist labor duties. The steward had to balance firmness with diplomacy to maintain order and ensure the manor's productivity. Economically, the rolls helped manage the manor's complex web of labor services, the days that peasants owed working the lord's domain lands. This corvée labor was central to the manor's agricultural output, but required careful scheduling and enforcement. The rolls tracked who owed what and whether services were fulfilled. Additionally, the rolls detailed payments in kind produce, such as grain, eggs, or wool that tenants provided instead of or alongside labor. These payments required precise accounting, as shortfalls could threaten the lord's income. Over time, the growing complexity of these records reflected changes in feudal society. As cash economies expanded in some regions, rents were increasingly commuted to monetary payments. Manorial rolls adapted to track these shifts, highlighting their role as living documents that evolved alongside economic transformations. Despite their administrative importance, the rolls were not infallible. Errors, omissions, and biases crept in. The steward's personal interests or local politics sometimes influenced entries, and distant lords had to trust reports filtered through these local lenses. For historians, these imperfections provide clues about the human element behind the bureaucracy. They remind us that the manorial system was not a static structure, but a dynamic, often contested, network of relationships maintained through negotiation, record-keeping, and daily labor. As you consider the endless pages of manorial rolls and the lives they represent, ask yourself, how did the slow grind of bureaucracy sustain a system built on hierarchy and obligation? What tensions simmered beneath the surface of these meticulous records? And in what ways did such detailed administration shape the fabric of medieval rural communities? The manorial rolls, painstakingly maintained across centuries, became a crucial framework for understanding how medieval rural society functioned, not just as a system of economic management, but as a living tapestry of relationships, law, and landscape. As the Middle Ages progressed, the feudal system experienced significant pressures. Population growth, climatic fluctuations, and economic shifts gradually transformed agricultural practices and social relations. Yet, throughout these changes, the rolls remained a vital tool for managing uncertainty. They recorded inheritances, transfers, and disputes over land that shaped patterns of settlement and tenure. They chronicled adaptations to new crops, labor, arrangements, and market influences. In this sense, the rolls were not static. They evolved to meet the needs of lords and tenants navigating a changing world. By the late medieval period, with the rise of more centralized states and commercial economies, manorial roles began to lose their centrality. Cash, rents, and wage labor replaced some traditional obligations, and other forms of record-keeping emerged. Still, the legacy of these exhaustive records endures. For modern historians and archaeologists, manorial rolls offer a rare, detailed glimpse into the rhythms of everyday life centuries ago. They reveal how ordinary people negotiated their lives within a rigid social hierarchy, how land and labor were managed, and how local communities adapted to broader forces. They also highlight the often overlooked significance of bureaucratic systems in history, how slow, deliberate record-keeping underpinned complex societies. Without such records, much of what we know about medieval rural life would remain invisible, lost to time. Reflecting on the manorial roles, consider this: how do the quiet, persistent efforts of scribes and stewards compare to the dramatic events often celebrated in history? In what ways do these detailed, boring records shape our understanding of the past? And what might they teach us about the unseen systems that continue to organize society today? When you picture the Roman Empire, you might envision grand spectacles, military conquests, or opulent villas, but underlying Rome's vast power was a less glamorous, yet essential infrastructure: the Roman roads. These extensive networks stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, connecting cities, forts, and provinces. Roman roads were not just pathways, they were lifelines that enabled military movements, trade, communication, and administration, constructed with remarkable engineering precision. These roads followed standardized methods, using layers of materials to create durable surfaces capable of withstanding years of use. Yet building the roads was only the beginning. Their maintenance was a constant, monotonous task that required the empire's attention to detail and resource management. Roads faced damage from weather, wear, and the heavy traffic of carts, soldiers, and animals. The responsibility for upkeep fell largely to local communities, military units stationed nearby, and specialized laborers. Maintenance involved repairing ruts, clearing debris, reinforcing edges, and sometimes rebuilding sections entirely. This work was often unheralded, but critical for the empire's cohesion. The logistics of road maintenance reveal much about Roman administration. Surveys were conducted to assess road conditions, and officials kept detailed records of repairs and costs. Taxes or labor obligations, known as opera publicor, frequently levied on local populations to fund these efforts. For local residents, road maintenance was a burdensome duty, but also an opportunity. Well-maintained roads facilitated commerce and travel, potentially bringing prosperity and connectivity. Conversely, neglect could isolate communities and hamper economic activities. The scale of the Roman road network was staggering. By the empire's height, approximately 400,000 kilometers of roads existed, including 80,000 kilometers of paved highways. Maintaining this vast infrastructure was a slow, continuous process requiring organization and manpower. Interestingly, some roads were maintained for centuries, with repairs documented across generations. The enduring nature of Roman roads testifies to the effectiveness of their maintenance systems, even as political power shifted. As you contemplate the slow, repetitive labor of road upkeep, consider, what did this persistent maintenance say about Roman priorities and governance? How did the mundane work of repair shape the empire's ability to endure? And how might these ancient roads, quietly preserved through effort and routine, connect us to a world long past? Maintaining Roman roads was a task that demanded more than just occasional patchwork. It was a continuous commitment that intertwined the lives of local communities, military personnel, and imperial officials, all orchestrated under a complex bureaucratic system. At the local level, road upkeep was often a mandated obligation. Landowners and village communities were required to contribute labor, materials, or funds to repair and maintain the sections of road that passed through their territories. This duty was sometimes formalized through legal codes and local customs, creating a steady stream of resources devoted to infrastructure maintenance. The quality of these contributions, however, varied widely. Some communities complied diligently, recognizing that good roads were vital to their economic well-being. Others resisted or neglected their responsibilities, leading to deterioration and official penalties. Military units stationed along key routes played a crucial role. Roman legions, skilled in engineering, frequently undertook maintenance tasks, especially in strategic border regions. Their expertise ensured repairs were durable and met imperial standards. But this also meant diverting soldiers from other duties, reflecting a trade-off in resources. The logistics of coordinating road maintenance across the vast empire were staggering. Imperial administrators maintained detailed registers documenting road conditions, repair schedules, and budgets. Overseers inspected sections regularly, reporting to provincial governors and central officials. Supply chains delivered stone, gravel, lime, and timber to repair sites. In some regions, local quarries and forests supplied materials, but in others, resources had to be transported long distances. This created additional layers of complexity and cost. Interestingly, the Romans employed specialized teams, sometimes called curators, virum dedicated to overseeing road construction and maintenance. These officials coordinated labor, managed budgets, and ensured standards were upheld. Their work required not only engineering knowledge, but also administrative skill and political savvy. The persistent effort to maintain roads also reflected broader Roman values of order, control, and connectivity. Roads symbolized the reach of Roman authority, binding diverse provinces into a cohesive whole. They were instruments of power as much as practical necessities. For travelers, merchants, and soldiers, well-maintained roads meant safer, faster journeys. For local communities, roads could open new markets and opportunities, even as the burden of maintenance weighed on them. As you ponder the day-to-day labor of Roman road upkeep, ask yourself, how did the empire balance the demands of maintenance with the realities of local resistance and resource limits? What can the careful records and bureaucratic oversight tell us about Roman governance? And how did these slow, repetitive efforts help build a legacy that still shapes modern infrastructure? The centuries-long commitment to road maintenance helped ensure that Roman roads remained functional arteries of the empire, supporting military campaigns, trade networks, and communication systems long after their initial construction. These roads, painstakingly cared for by generations of workers and officials, became more than infrastructure. They were symbols of Roman continuity and imperial reach. Despite political upheavals, wars, and changing dynasties, many Roman roads remained in use well into the medieval period and beyond. Their durable construction, combined with the steady, if unglamorous upkeep, allowed them to endure for millennia. Modern highways often trace these ancient routes, a testament to the longevity of their design and maintenance. The labor behind this endurance, anonymous workers repairing stone pavements, clearing drainage ditches, and hauling materials rarely appears in grand histories. Yet their persistent, repetitive work shaped the very fabric of the empire's connectivity. The quiet diligence of local communities, military engineers, and administrators formed an invisible backbone holding the empire together. This legacy challenges how we view power and empire. Rather than solely focusing on battles or rulers, it reminds us that monumental achievements often rest on the slow, steady efforts of many. The empire's strength lay not only in conquest, but in the capacity to organize and sustain essential systems over time. The Roman road network and its maintenance also highlight the interplay between centralized authority and local participation. While Rome set standards and oversight, local actors bore much of the burden and benefited in varying degrees. This balance was crucial for the system's survival, revealing a complex relationship between power and obligation. As you reflect on the monotonous yet vital work of road maintenance, consider this: how do modern societies continue to depend on the unseen labor of infrastructure upkeep? What parallels exist between ancient empires and today's networks of roads, bridges, and utilities? And how might appreciating the mundane tasks behind great achievements change the way we understand history? When you think of medieval cathedrals, your mind might drift to soaring spires, magnificent stained glass, and grand religious ceremonies. Yet behind these awe-inspiring structures lies an extended story of persistent, often tedious labor stretching across generations. Cathedral construction in medieval Europe was a monumental endeavor, not only in scale but in time. Many cathedrals took centuries to complete, with building phases interrupted and resumed as resources, politics, and artistic styles evolved. Unlike a single project with a clear deadline, cathedrals were ongoing works, continuously expanded, repaired, and altered. At the heart of this process were thousands of workers, masons, carpenters, glaziers, laborers, and apprentices. Their days were filled with repetitive, painstaking tasks: cutting stones, mixing mortar, hoisting heavy timbers, or grinding pigments for stained glass. This slow, methodical work demanded skill, patience, and coordination. The logistics of cathedral building were staggering. Quarries supplied massive amounts of stone, often transported over long distances by river or cart. Timber for scaffolding and roofing had to be carefully harvested and seasoned. Workshops produced intricate carvings, metalwork, and glass components, each requiring specialized knowledge and techniques. Funding these projects was a complex affair. Cathedrals relied on donations from wealthy patrons, church authorities, and local communities. Sometimes, funding ebbed and flowed, causing work to slow or pause. Despite these challenges, construction persisted, driven by religious devotion and civic pride. Beyond the physical labor, cathedral building involved detailed planning and administration. Master masons and architects designed evolving blueprints, adjusted to accommodate structural innovations or stylistic trends like the transition from Romanesque to Gothic. Documents recorded work, progress, expenses, and workforce management, creating an extensive bureaucratic record. The cathedral was more than a building. It was a symbol of communal identity and spiritual aspiration. Its construction shaped the social and economic life of towns, providing employment, fostering crafts, and reinforcing hierarchies. Yet, for those laboring daily on scaffoldings or in workshops, the work was repetitive and exhausting, often dangerous. Life expectancy for workers was low, and accidents were common. Despite this, the slow progress of construction connected generations, with fathers and sons sometimes sharing the same project. As you imagine these endless tasks stretching over decades and centuries, ask yourself, how did the combination of faith, social structures, and economic realities sustain such prolonged labor? What did the daily routines of workers reveal about medieval life? And how did these monumental works, built over time, influence the communities around them? The construction of medieval cathedrals was not only a feat of engineering, but also a profound human enterprise, involving a diverse cast of characters working within a highly structured and hierarchical system. Understanding the people behind the stone reveals the complexity and challenges of these long-term projects. At the top of this hierarchy stood the master mason, often the project's de facto architect and manager. His role was multifaceted, designing, supervising, training apprentices, procuring materials, and liaising with patrons and clergy. The master mason needed not only technical knowledge, but also administrative acumen and political skill to navigate competing interests. Beneath him worked teams of skilled craftsmen stonemasons, carving blocks into precise shapes, carpenters, constructing scaffolding and timber frameworks, glassmakers, creating intricate stained glass panels, and metalworkers forging clamps, nails, and decorative elements. Each specialty required years of apprenticeship, producing craftsmen capable of meeting the demanding standards of cathedral art and structure. Laborers, often unskilled, performed the heavy lifting, moving stones, mixing mortar, digging foundations, tasks critical but physically exhausting. Their work was repetitive and hazardous. Falls, collapses, and accidents were common. The workforce was seasonal and fluctuating. Many workers were peasants or townsfolk supplementing their income during off-peak agricultural periods. This seasonal labor affected the pace of construction, which often slowed during winter or planting seasons. Work sites were buzzing with activity and constant noise, the ringing of hammers, the grating of chisels, the creak of pulleys. Yet, despite this bustle, the work required extraordinary patience and precision. Every block had to fit exactly. Any mistake could compromise the entire structure. Supply chains for materials were complex. Stone was quarried locally or transported from afar. Timber was harvested and seasoned with care. Pigments for glass and paint were sourced across Europe. Delays in materials could halt work, requiring master masons to adjust plans continually. Financial management was a continuous challenge. Funding came from multiple sources: church revenues, indulgences, donations, and municipal taxes. Chronic shortages meant that work often proceeded in fits and starts. Records show frequent appeals to patrons and church authorities to secure funds. Cathedral construction also embodied a unique relationship between sacred purpose and practical reality. The goal was to create a house of God worthy of divine presence. Yet this vision was realized through mundane, unglamorous work. This long collective effort fostered a sense of communal identity. Townspeople often saw themselves as contributors to a sacred project, with guilds and families passing skills down generations. As you reflect on the many hands shaping stone and glass, consider, how did the blend of faith, craft, and bureaucracy sustain these projects across generations? What social dynamics emerged among workers, patrons, and clergy? And how did this interplay of devotion and labor leave an imprint on the medieval world? After decades, sometimes centuries, of slow and steady labor, many medieval cathedrals reached completion, or at least a state of functional grandeur. Yet even then, the work never fully ceased. Cathedrals required constant upkeep, repair, and artistic additions, ensuring that construction remained a lifelong commitment for communities and craftsmen alike. The completed cathedral stood as a monumental testament to faith, skill, and social cooperation. It dominated the skyline, drawing pilgrims, fostering local pride, and acting as a hub for religious and civic life. Its soaring vaults and intricate stained glass reflected not only theological ideals, but also the cumulative efforts of countless workers, patrons, and clergy. The ongoing maintenance and modifications kept the cathedral as a living entity. Whether structural stresses and evolving tastes meant repairs and renovations were frequent. Master masons passed knowledge to successors who continued the legacy, creating a continuous chain of craftsmanship. The social impact was profound. Guilds formed around cathedral construction, providing training, mutual support, and standards of quality that shaped medieval labor markets. Families involved in building projects often gained social status and economic opportunity, tying their identity to the cathedral's story. Yet, the prolonged nature of construction and maintenance also reflected the limits and vulnerabilities of medieval society. Economic downturns, political turmoil, and plagues could stall or alter projects. The shifting priorities of church authorities or patrons sometimes redirected resources elsewhere. Still, the cathedral endured as a symbol of human persistence, faith, and cooperation. Its very existence reminds us how grand historical achievements are often the result of patient, repetitive labor carried out across generations, rather than sudden bursts of inspiration or heroic acts. As you consider the story of medieval cathedral construction, think about the broader lessons it offers. How does sustained collective effort shape human history? What does this slow accumulation of work tell us about the societies that built these monuments, and how might appreciating these boring details enrich our understanding of cultural heritage? When you imagine the Ottoman Empire, images of grand palaces, powerful sultans, and sprawling armies often come to mind. But behind the empire's impressive military and political might lay an extensive, if tedious, administrative system. Its tax registers, or terrier deftalieri, These were exhaustive surveys documenting land ownership, population, and taxable resources throughout the empire's vast territories. Tax registers were far from glamorous. They were cumbersome, repetitive records, painstakingly compiled by officials known as yet they formed the backbone of Ottoman governance, enabling the state to assess and collect revenues, manage land tenure, and maintain control over diverse populations. The process began with detailed censuses of villages, towns, and agricultural lands. Officials recorded not only the number of households, but also the type of crops grown, livestock held, and resources like mills or vineyards. Each entry reflected a calculation of the taxable value, which in turn determined the state's revenue. This administrative work required immense coordination. Surveyors had to travel vast regions, often navigating challenging terrain and complex local politics. Accuracy was vital. Underreporting could reduce tax revenues, while overreporting risked rebellion or economic hardship. The tax registers were updated periodically, sometimes every few years, reflecting changes due to population, growth, land redistribution, or political shifts. Maintaining these records was a slow, continuous task requiring meticulous attention to detail. For the peasants and landowners, the tax register was a double-edged sword. It formalized their obligations to the state, but also provided a degree of legal recognition of land rights. However, the burden of taxation was often heavy, especially in times of war or economic stress. Beyond revenue collection, these registers served as tools of imperial control, integrating newly conquered territories and populations into the Ottoman administrative framework. The registers helped standardize governance across culturally and geographically diverse lands, from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula. Though tedious, the creation and maintenance of tax registers reveal much about the empire's priorities and strategies. They showcase how a sprawling empire depended on slow, repetitive administrative work to sustain itself. As you reflect on these dry, detailed documents, consider, what do they reveal about the relationship between state and society in the Ottoman world? How did bureaucratic precision shape imperial power? And how might such mundane records be crucial to understanding the daily lives of millions? The compilation and upkeep of Ottoman tax registers were not just bureaucratic tasks. They involved a network of officials, local intermediaries, and communities, each playing a role in sustaining the empire's fiscal health. Understanding this network reveals how administrative monotony underpinned imperial strength. At the top were the Defterder's higher-ranking financial officers responsible for overseeing tax collection and managing the empire's finances. They coordinated with provincial governors, beys, and pashas, who ensured local compliance and provided reports on tax revenues. Closer to the ground, surveyors, terreses, conducted detailed censuses. These men traveled to villages and towns, often accompanied by local leaders or clerks, recording the number of households, types of crops, livestock counts, and even the status of non-Muslim subjects who had different tax obligations. Accuracy was a constant concern. Surveyors had to navigate incomplete or conflicting information, local resistance, and the complexities of land tenure. In some cases, peasants tried to underreport property or resources to reduce tax burdens, while local elites might manipulate records for political gain. Once collected, data were compiled into tax registers with rigorous categorization. Land was classified by type, arable, pasture, orchard, ownership status, and productivity. Taxes were calculated based on these details, including kift, a unit of land measurement roughly equal to what a single plow team could cultivate. The registers were updated periodically, usually every 10 to 20 years, depending on the region's stability and administrative capacity. This slow pace meant that sometimes the records lagged behind reality, creating challenges in tax enforcement. Beyond taxation, these registers had legal significance. They formalized property rights, helping resolve disputes and delineate land boundaries. This gave them an unexpected role as documents of social order. The painstaking nature of this work illustrates the Ottoman state's reliance on bureaucratic rigor to manage its diversity. The empire encompassed multiple languages, religions, and customs. Tax registers helped standardize governance across this complexity. For local communities, the registers were reminders of imperial presence, but also instruments that could impose hardship or provide protection. The tension between state control and local autonomy played out in these detailed records. As you imagine the slow, repetitive work of surveyors and clerks, ask yourself, how did this tedious bureaucracy maintain the delicate balance of empire? What does the reliance on written records tell us about Ottoman administration? And how might these dry documents open windows into the lives of ordinary subjects centuries ago? The Ottoman tax registers, despite their tedious and repetitive nature, played a crucial role in shaping the empire's longevity and influence. They exemplify how a sprawling multi-ethnic empire depended on meticulous, ongoing administrative work to function. By creating standardized records of land, population, and taxation, the empire was able to exert control over vast territories with limited military presence. These registers facilitated not only tax collection, but also legal governance, dispute resolution, and social organization. Moreover, the registers provide historians today with invaluable insights into the economic and demographic realities of the Ottoman world. They reveal patterns of land use, social hierarchy, and even cultural diversity, serving as windows into lives often absent from grand narratives. The painstaking process of updating and maintaining these records also highlights the resilience of bureaucratic institutions. Even during periods of conflict or decline, the administration sought to keep the wheels turning, underscoring the importance of routine over spectacle in sustaining empires. For the common people recorded in these registers, the documents were a reminder of both obligation and protection, a double-edged sword, binding them to the state while granting a degree of recognition. As you consider the tiresome yet vital work behind these tax registers, reflect on the broader significance. How does routine bureaucratic labor underpin the rise and fall of empires? What parallels exist in today's administrative systems? And how might the mundane records of yesterday hold the keys to understanding the complex realities of past societies? In the vast expanse of the Ming Dynasty 1368 to 1644, the management of grain supplies was a monumental task essential to the survival of millions and the stability of the empire. This story, while seemingly dull, reveals the quiet yet critical administrative work that sustained one of history's largest and most complex states. Grain was the lifeblood of the Ming economy and society. It fed the population, supported armies, and was a form of tax payment. Managing its storage, distribution, and accounting was vital to prevent famine, civil unrest, and economic collapse. The empire built an extensive network of granaries, from local village storehouses to massive provincial and imperial reserves. These granaries were carefully constructed to protect against spoilage, pests, and theft. Yet, even with the best design, constant vigilance was required to monitor grain quality and quantities. Inventorying grain stocks was a painstaking, repetitive process carried out by officials called liangshi and kangguan. These men would count sacks of grain, record quantities, check for damage, and maintain detailed ledgers. Their work was slow and methodical, often carried out under strict supervision to prevent corruption. The inventory process was scheduled regularly, monthly, seasonally, and annually to track inflows and outflows. Accurate records were critical for planning distributions to soldiers, government workers, and famine relief efforts. The logistics were staggering. Grain had to be transported from productive agricultural regions to storage sites, sometimes over great distances via river, canal, or land routes. Weather, banditry, and transportation limitations often complicated these efforts. Officials faced constant challenges, ensuring honest reporting, combating spoilage, and responding to unpredictable events like droughts or floods. Even a small miscalculation could have cascading effects, leading to shortages or surpluses. Beyond administration, the granaries represented the state's presence in daily life. They were symbols of imperial care and control, linking the emperor's authority to the well-being of the populace. As you contemplate these tedious inventories, consider, how did such detailed record-keeping sustain an empire? What were the human stories behind the numbers, the officials, laborers, and farmers? And how might this mundane but vital work have shaped the stability and decline of the Ming dynasty? The grand granaries of the Ming dynasty were not just stone and wood. They were living centers of continuous, repetitive human effort. The officials, laborers, and local communities who managed these stores were essential to the empire's survival. Yet their work often went unnoticed beyond the ledgers. Officials, known as liangshi, were responsible for overseeing grain inventories. Their role required careful accounting skills, integrity, and vigilance. They had to balance pressures from higher authorities demanding accurate reporting with local challenges such as theft, spoilage, or incomplete deliveries. These officials worked alongside Kangguan granary wardens who managed day-to-day operations, including guarding stores, supervising laborers, and coordinating shipments. The granary workforce included laborers who unloaded sacks, repaired structures, and prepared grain for redistribution. The inventory process itself was slow and painstaking. Counting grain was not as simple as it sounds. Officials had to estimate quantities in large bins, weigh sacks, and inspect for quality. Mistakes or intentional falsification could lead to shortages or political consequences. Transporting grain to and from granaries was another demanding task. Waterways like the Grand Canal were vital arteries, but subject to seasonal variations and logistical difficulties. Overland transport required manpower and animals, and was vulnerable to banditry. Local communities also played a role, as farmers delivered tax grain to nearby storehouses. These deliveries connected imperial administration with rural life, embedding state authority into everyday economic activity. The state's investment in granary management reveals a commitment to long-term stability, preventing famine and ensuring a steady food supply were central concerns reflected in policies, inspections, and emergency grain releases. Yet the system was fragile. Natural disasters, corruption, and political instability could disrupt supplies, sometimes with devastating consequences for the populace. Reflecting on the repetitive, detailed tasks behind grain management, you might ask, how did these continuous efforts shape the resilience of the Ming state? What pressures did officials face balancing imperial demands with local realities? And how did this mundane work reflect broader themes of governance and survival? The detailed grain inventories and the laborious management of the Ming served as a quiet but indispensable foundation for the dynasty's governance and longevity. While battles and political intrigue often dominate historical narratives, it was the steady, repetitive work of officials and laborers keeping grain flowing that helped maintain social order. Throughout the Ming era, granaries acted as buffers against famine and economic crises, allowing the state to intervene in times of crop failure or war. This practical aspect of governance, grounded in meticulous record-keeping and logistical coordination, reveals a sophisticated understanding of statecraft. The granary system also linked imperial authority to everyday life in rural China, reinforcing the emperor's role as provider and protector. The extensive networks of officials and local agents created an administrative web that extended the state's reach deep into the countryside. However, the system's reliance on repetitive human effort made it vulnerable. Corruption, mismanagement, and natural disasters could overwhelm even the best organized infrastructure. In the later Ming period, weakening central control contributed to food shortages and unrest, illustrating the fragile balance maintained by these mundane tasks. Today, the surviving granary records offer historians rich data on agricultural production, taxation, and local administration. These documents, though dry and repetitive, open a window into the economic life of Ming China and the complexities of imperial governance. As you think back on the tedious inventories and the people behind them, consider this: how does the endurance of an empire depend on countless small, repetitive actions rather than grand events? What lessons might this teach us about the unseen labor that supports societies? And how does recognizing the importance of these boring details enrich our understanding of history's vast tapestry? When you picture the Roman Empire, you might envision vast armies, monumental architecture, and sprawling cities. But underpinning all of these was an extensive network of roads, thousands of miles of carefully constructed stone pathways that connected the farthest reaches of the empire. These roads weren't just built once and forgotten. Maintaining them was a slow, continuous process essential to Rome's survival and administration. Roman roads began as military necessities designed to move troops quickly across the empire. Over time, they became vital arteries for commerce, communication, and governance. Their construction followed a rigorous method: layers of stone, gravel, and sand compacted to create durable, weather-resistant surfaces. Yet the initial construction was only the beginning. Roads were exposed to the elements, heavy traffic, and natural wear and tear. Regular maintenance was mandatory to prevent degradation, filling potholes, repairing drainage ditches, clearing debris, and sometimes rebuilding entire stretches. This maintenance work was often dull and repetitive, carried out by local laborers, soldiers, or slaves under the supervision of Roman engineers. The work had to be done in sections, as the empire's vastness made continuous supervision impossible. Funding for road upkeep came from various sources: imperial treasury allocations, provincial taxes, or local communities responsible for curators virum road caretakers. The complexity of managing resources for such a vast network was a constant challenge. Road maintenance also reflected the empire's administrative sophistication. Records were kept on road conditions, repairs needed, and labor assigned. These reports ensured accountability and helped prioritize resources. Moreover, roads were more than infrastructure. They symbolized Roman order and power. Well-maintained roads reinforced imperial presence and facilitated integration of distant provinces. Despite the significance, maintenance was often neglected. During periods of political instability or economic strain, neglected roads slowed troop movements, hampered trade, and undermined imperial control. As you consider the slow, unglamorous work of road maintenance, ponder this: how did these repetitive tasks support the vast ambitions of the Roman Empire? What challenges did officials face coordinating repairs across continents? And how might the fate of an empire hinge on the condition of its roads? The vast network of Roman roads depended not only on engineering skill, but also on the steady work of countless individuals who toiled to keep the routes passable. Behind the grand image of Roman infrastructure was a system of slow, repetitive labor that ensured the empire's arteries remained functional. Laborers who maintained roads included soldiers, local workers, and sometimes slaves, each contributing to tasks like clearing debris, filling potholes, repairing drainage, and reinforcing embankments. These tasks were repetitive, requiring patience and consistency rather than creativity. The role of curators virum, official road caretakers, was central to managing these efforts. Appointed by provincial governors or the emperor, they oversaw inspections, organized labor, and allocated funds for repairs. Their work involved detailed record-keeping and navigating local politics to secure cooperation. Funding was a chronic issue. Maintenance costs could be high, especially in remote regions with harsh weather or challenging terrain. When political crises struck, road repairs often lagged, illustrating the connection between infrastructure upkeep and broader stability. Local communities sometimes shared responsibility, especially for smaller roads connecting villages. They provided labor or materials, tying communal survival to road conditions. Well-maintained roads facilitated trade, travel, and access to markets, so villagers had a vested interest. Despite these efforts, roads faced constant threats. Heavy rains caused erosion, seasonal flooding damaged foundations, and constant traffic wore surfaces thin. Repairing one section might only delay inevitable damage elsewhere. The slow, repetitive nature of this maintenance work also meant progress could be frustratingly incremental. Long stretches might remain in poor condition for years, limiting the efficiency of the road network. Yet, even imperfect, the Roman road system endured for centuries, allowing the empire to project power, facilitate communication, and integrate diverse peoples. As you think about the endless cycles of repair and decay, ask yourself, how did these routine tasks reflect the strengths and weaknesses of Roman administration? What tensions existed between local and imperial interests in road upkeep? And how might understanding such repetitive work reshape our view of empire building? The Roman road system, maintained through slow, repetitive work over centuries, was more than just stone and gravel. Ambition and organization, the seemingly boring details of repair, inspection, and record-keeping underpinned Rome's ability to govern a vast, diverse territory. Even when political turmoil or economic downturns strained resources, the persistence of road maintenance reflected the empire's commitment to infrastructure as a pillar of state power. Roads enabled the swift movement of armies, the flow of goods, and communication across provinces, knitting together the empire's far-flung regions. The legacy of Roman roads is visible today in modern highways and transport routes that trace ancient pathways. Their durability owes much to the routine, repetitive labor of countless individual soldiers, laborers, officials whose work often went unrecorded in history's grand narratives. Understanding this labor reveals a quieter side of empire building. Success often depended not on dramatic conquests, but on mundane, continuous efforts to maintain what was built. The Roman roads remind us that the stability and cohesion of vast political entities rely on the endurance of such ordinary, repetitive work. As you reflect on these dusty paths and the slow march of maintenance crews, consider this: how does history change when we focus on routine labor rather than spectacular events? What might this teach us about the importance of infrastructure and administration in shaping civilizations? And how do these boring but essential tasks resonate in our modern world, where infrastructure remains vital, yet often overlooked? In the sprawling Qing dynasty of China, 1644 to 1912, conducting a census was an immense, repetitive task fundamental to governance. Unlike modern censuses that rely on technology, Qing officials had to depend on manual record-keeping and extensive local cooperation to count millions of people across vast, diverse territories. The primary purpose of the census was to assess population size for taxation, conscription, and social control. It was essential for determining how much grain or labor each community owed to the imperial state. But the process was fraught with challenges. Census takers, often local magistrates or appointed officials, traveled to villages and households, recording names, ages, genders, occupations, family relationships, and property holdings. Their work required meticulous attention to detail and adherence to bureaucratic procedures. However, the census faced frequent inaccuracies. Households might underreport numbers to avoid taxes or military service. Migrant populations, nomadic groups, and ethnic minorities complicated data collection. Some officials were corrupt or negligent, leading to flawed or incomplete records. Despite these challenges, the Qing government invested heavily in data were compiled in detailed ledgers, known as Huji household registers, which became key administrative tools for local and provincial authorities. The process was repetitive, tedious, and slow. In many cases, census updates occurred only once every few years or decades, making records outdated by the time they were used for policy decisions. The census wasn't merely a dry, bureaucratic exercise. It reflected the state's attempt to exert control over an enormous and culturally diverse population. It linked the emperor's authority to the lives of millions through numbers, lists, and forms. As you consider the painstaking census process, think about this. How did such repetitive counting influence the Qing dynasty's ability to govern? What effects did inaccuracies have on people's lives? And how might these detailed yet flawed records reveal deeper insights into Qing society? The Qing dynasty's census taking was not just an administrative formality. It was a complicated, often frustrating exercise that exposed the limits of imperial control over its vast, diverse population. One of the major challenges was the sheer scale of the territory. The Qing ruled over regions as varied as the densely populated plains of the Yangtze, the nomadic steppes of Mongolia, and the mountainous frontiers of Tibet. Each area presented different difficulties for census officials. In agricultural heartlands, officials generally had easier access to villages and households, but even here, many families sought to evade taxes or conscription by hiding members, especially adult males. Census takers had to negotiate with local leaders and use sometimes coercive methods to ensure compliance. In frontier regions, counting nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples proved even more difficult. These groups moved seasonally and often resisted integration into the bureaucratic system. Officials relied on indirect methods, such as estimates or reports from tribal leaders, which reduced accuracy. Ethnic minorities and linguistic diversity added further complications. Census instructions were standardized in Chinese, but many communities spoke other languages or had different social structures, making communication and classification difficult. Moreover, corruption and incompetence among officials undermined the process. Some manipulated figures to avoid their own tax burdens or to hide population declines caused by famine, disease, or conflict. Others rushed through counts, resulting in incomplete or misleading data. Despite these problems, the census remained a critical tool for Qing administration. It influenced tax assessments, conscription quotas, and social policies. It also provided a demographic snapshot, informing the state's understanding of population growth, migration, and social change. Yet the repetitive nature of census and the persistence of errors meant that policy decisions were often based on outdated or inaccurate information. This mismatch could exacerbate tensions between the state and local communities. As you reflect on the difficulties of this monumental task, consider: how did the limitations of census data shape Qing governance? What impact did inaccuracies have on ordinary people? And how do these challenges resonate with the modern complexities of population counting? The Qing dynasty's relentless efforts to count its population, despite frequent inaccuracies and obstacles, reveal the importance the empire placed on bureaucratic control through data. The census was more than numbers. It was a tool to bind the state to its subjects, to allocate resources, and to enforce order. The huge household registers, painstakingly compiled and updated, became foundational for tax collection, conscription, and social organization. These records also inadvertently preserved detailed demographic and social information that modern historians now use to understand Qing society's complexities. Yet the flaws and gaps in the census process reflect the limits of imperial power. The persistence of underreporting, evasion, and local resistance shows how people negotiated and sometimes resisted state demands. This dynamic shaped Qing governance, forcing officials to adapt policies and enforcement strategies. The repetitive nature of census taking, recounting the same populations over decades, underscored the challenge of managing an empire of unprecedented scale and diversity. The tedious administration behind the scenes was critical to the dynasty's endurance, but also revealed its vulnerabilities. Reflecting on this, consider how the seemingly dull task of census taking echoes in today's world, where governments continue to grapple with population data's accuracy and political implications. How do routine bureaucratic activities shape the relationship between state and society? And what can the Qing census teach us about the balance between control, cooperation, and resistance? In medieval Europe, the Church was not only a spiritual authority, but also a vast administrative power. One of its less glamorous but vital tasks was conducting regular censuses, or, more precisely, parish surveysment, to count souls for taxation, tithes, and spiritual oversight. Unlike modern censuses, these surveys were deeply intertwined with religious life. Parish priests would record the names and statuses of their flock, documenting births, deaths, marriages, and church attendance. Produce or income given to the church. The process was slow and repetitive. Parishioners might be counted annually or at intervals determined by local bishops. The priest's ledgers, often handwritten on parchment, accumulated pages of names, dates, and notes. This mundane task reflected broader medieval concerns about order and salvation. Knowing who belonged to the community was both a practical matter for taxation and a spiritual one for ensuring the souls were tended. The census also mirrored the Church's vast reach into daily life. Even remote villages were part of the ecclesiastical web, and the accuracy of these records affected the Church's financial health and influence. However, the process was vulnerable to inaccuracies. Illiteracy, mobility, and local resistance often complicated record-keeping. Some parishioners avoided tithes by hiding assets or temporarily relocating. Despite these challenges, the Church's census efforts provided a unique demographic record of medieval Europe, preserving insights into population size, family structures, and social obligations. As you think about these repetitive counts of souls, ask yourself, how did the Church's bureaucracy shape medieval society? What tensions arose between spiritual care and financial demands? And how might these tedious rituals reveal deeper connections between faith, power, and daily life? The Church's efforts to keep track of its flock through parish censuses involved a series of repetitive, detailed tasks carried out mostly by parish priests, who were responsible not only for spiritual leadership, but also for administrative duties. These tasks often took place in a context of limited resources and widespread illiteracy. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, and tithes owed. The accuracy of these records was crucial for the Church's ability to collect revenue and maintain influence. However, the repetitive nature of these record-keeping duties could overwhelm priests who balanced spiritual and administrative responsibilities. Poor record maintenance sometimes resulted in missed tithes or confusion over parish boundaries. Moreover, local populations often resisted the census for economic reasons. Paying tithes was a significant financial burden, especially during periods of poor harvest or conflict. Some parishioners would hide assets, underreport family members, or move temporarily to avoid taxation. Mobility also posed challenges. Pilgrimages, trade, travel, or displacement due to war and famine complicated the church's attempts to maintain accurate records. Transient populations were difficult to track, leading to gaps in the census. The church's census efforts also varied regionally. Wealthier or more centralized dioceses might have better record-keeping systems, while remote or poorer areas lagged behind. Despite these challenges, the records collected offer valuable insights into medieval life, revealing patterns of family, mortality, and social obligations that historians rely on today. As you ponder the slow, repetitive work of parish priests and the complexities of medieval staking, consider: how did this administrative routine shape the church's role in society? What conflicts arose between spiritual care and financial necessity? And how do these records deepen our understanding of everyday medieval life? The church's parish censuses, though slow, repetitive, and often frustrating for both clergy and laity, played a crucial role in medieval European society. These detailed records reinforced the church's dual role as spiritual shepherd and economic authority. By maintaining vast ledgers of births, deaths, marriages, and tithes, the church shaped social structures and relationships. The administrative routine was not merely a bureaucratic necessity. It was a key mechanism by which the church extended its influence into every household. These records, imperfect as they were, provide historians with invaluable demographic and social data. They reveal the rhythms of medieval life, the ebb and flow of populations, the impact of famine and plague, and the intertwining of religious practice with daily survival. Yet the tensions inherent in this system between spiritual guidance and fiscal demands highlight the complex relationship between power and piety. Parishioners' efforts to evade tithes remind us that even in deeply religious societies, economic realities shaped behavior and resistance. Reflecting on the church's monotonous census rituals, consider this: how do repetitive administrative tasks support vast institutions? In what ways do the tensions between duty and resistance shape social order? And what lessons can we draw from medieval record-keeping for understanding the interplay of faith, governance, and everyday life? The Ottoman Empire, stretching across 3 continents at its peak, relied heavily on meticulous record-keeping to manage its vast and diverse populations. At the heart of this administrative machinery were the Tahrir tax registers, documents listing landholdings, households, and taxable resources throughout the empire. These registers were far from static. Ottoman officials periodically updated them through comprehensive surveys, an exercise both repetitive and exhaustive. Teams of scribes and local administrators traveled to villages and towns, gathering information on agricultural production, population, and taxable assets. The process was painstaking. Data was recorded by hand, requiring precision and care to avoid errors that could disrupt tax collection or cause disputes. Given the empire's size, this was a continuous effort, with some regions surveyed every few years, others less frequently. The terrier registers served multiple purposes beyond taxation. They helped allocate military conscription quotas, manage land tenure, and even inform legal disputes. These documents were essential to the empire's ability to exert control over distant provinces and ensure a steady flow of revenue to Istanbul. However, the repetitive nature of these surveys also meant the system was vulnerable to corruption, data manipulation, and local resistance. Taxpayers might underreport holdings or bribe officials, while some scribes might falsify records to protect their patrons. Despite these challenges, the Ottoman tax registers remain a treasure trove of historical data, revealing details about rural life, social hierarchy, and economic conditions over centuries. As you consider the slow, methodical recording of land and people, think about this. How did these tedious administrative tasks sustain one of history's largest empires? What challenges did officials face balancing accuracy and local interests? And how did these records reshape our understanding of Ottoman governance and society? The Tahrir tax surveys were a massive logistical undertaking that required coordination between central authorities and local officials across the Ottoman Empire's vast expanse. Their success relied on the repetitive, painstaking work of countless individuals, scribes, tax collectors, village elders, all navigating complex social and political landscapes in the provinces. Survey teams often composed of chatibs, scribes, and multiseams tax farmers visited villages to gather data. They recorded information about cultivable land, livestock, households, and their taxable capacity. This required detailed questioning of villagers and local leaders who were sometimes reluctant or deceptive. The repetitive nature of the process was taxing on both officials and subjects. Villagers feared increased taxes or conscription quotas, and sometimes hid assets or provided misleading information. Officials, under pressure to fill quotas and meet revenue targets, might overlook discrepancies or engage in corrupt practices. Geography and seasonality also played roles. Surveying remote, mountainous, or desert regions was difficult, often delayed by weather or conflict. The process could take months or years, during which economic conditions might shift, rendering some data obsolete before it was fully processed. Despite these challenges, the tax registers formed the backbone of Ottoman fiscal policy. The empire's ability to maintain relatively stable revenue streams across diverse populations depended on the accuracy and regular updating of these records. The Tahrir system also reflects the balancing act between central authority and local autonomy. While Istanbul demanded data and taxes, local elites often manipulated surveys to protect their interests or assert power. As you reflect on the repeated cycles of surveying and recording, consider, how did these administrative routines reflect the broader dynamics of power within the empire? What tensions arose between accuracy, fairness, and political expediency? And how might these repetitive tasks illuminate the daily realities of both rulers and subjects in Ottoman society? The Ottoman Tahrir tax registers stand as a testament to the empire's reliance on slow, repetitive, and detailed administration to maintain control over its vast territories. These documents reveal how the empire managed to govern a patchwork of diverse peoples and landscapes through meticulous record-keeping. While the system was vulnerable to corruption and local manipulation, its endurance over centuries speaks to the importance of bureaucratic routine in sustaining imperial power. The repetitive surveys reinforced a relationship of accountability, however imperfect, between the central state and provincial communities. For ordinary villagers, the Terrier registers were a double-edged sword. They formalized tax obligations and conscription duties, but also sometimes offered protection by documenting rights and land claims. The records became legal evidence in disputes and a source of identity for communities. The tediousness of this record-keeping belies its significance. Through the repetitive cycles of surveying, recording, and updating, the Ottoman state wove a fragile but functioning network of governance that connected Istanbul to the furthest villages. As you think about this, consider, what does the slow, methodical nature of these records tell us about the exercise of power? How does repetitive bureaucracy both enable control and create opportunities for resistance? And in our modern world, where data management still underpins governance, what lessons might we draw from the Ottoman example? In the 17th and 18th centuries, the British East India Company grew from a small trading venture into a sprawling commercial empire across India and beyond. Behind this expansion lay a vast system of daily record-keeping logs, ledgers, and correspondence that tracked everything from ship movements and cargo to financial transactions and personnel. The EIC's daily logs were anything but glamorous. Company clerks spent hours meticulously recording routine details, ship arrivals and departures, stock inventories, trade deals, payments, and labor costs. These repetitive entries might seem tedious, but they were essential to the company's survival and growth. Operating across thousands of miles, with hundreds of ships and numerous trading posts, the company relied on accurate, up-to-date information. The logs helped prevent losses, detect fraud, and ensure smooth operations in an environment rife with uncertainty, from piracy to unpredictable monsoons. Beyond commercial details, the logs also recorded weather conditions, local events, and occasional conflicts with rival European powers or local rulers. Over time, they formed a detailed archive of colonial activity and cross-cultural interactions. The daily recording was slow, repetitive, and often prone to human error. Clerks faced pressure to maintain accuracy while managing large volumes of data. Yet, these mundane records were the backbone of one of history's most significant mercantile empires. As you reflect on these countless pages of routine notes, ask yourself, how did such monotonous record-keeping sustain imperial expansion? What challenges arose from managing vast amounts of data manually? And how do these logs help us understand the complex machinery behind colonial power? The British East India Company's daily logs, though seemingly mundane, reflected a complex and evolving information management system crucial to its commercial and political ambitions. As the company expanded its reach, the sheer volume of data it generated grew exponentially, creating new challenges for record keepers. Clerks and administrators were tasked with documenting every shipment, transaction, and personnel change across hundreds of ports and factories. They worked in offices filled with parchment, ink, and ledgers, often under stressful conditions. With tight deadlines, errors were common. Misspelled names, misplaced figures, or delayed reports could cause significant problems, from financial losses to diplomatic misunderstandings. To combat this, the company developed standardized formats for record keeping and introduced hierarchical supervision to verify entries. Managing information was further complicated by the diverse cultural and linguistic environment in India. Interpreters and local agents helped relay information, but miscommunication was frequent, adding layers of complexity to the clerk's tasks. Additionally, the logs captured more than commerce. They documented encounters with local societies, recording events such as famines, rebellions, and negotiations with Indian rulers. These records, while often dry, provide historians with crucial insights into colonial governance and its impacts. Despite their tedious nature, these logs enabled the company to navigate a turbulent and unfamiliar environment, balancing commercial interests with the exercise of political power. As you think about the painstaking work behind these daily logs, consider, how did repetitive documentation influence the company's control over far-flung territories? What were the limits of this bureaucratic approach? And how do such records challenge or reinforce our understanding of colonial history? The British East India Company's daily logs, though tedious and repetitive, were foundational to its transformation from a trading corporation into a ruling power in India. These unremarkable pages formed a web of information that connected distant factories, ports, and administrative centers, enabling centralized control over complex operations. The persistence of clerks in recording routine transactions ensured that the company could track resources, respond to crises, and enforce policies across thousands of miles. This bureaucratic rigor masked the profound social and political changes the company's expansion brought to India. Yet, these records also reveal the limits of imperial power. Errors, delays, and gaps in data show how fragile the company's control could be, dependent on human diligence and the cooperation of local intermediaries. The logs, in their repetition, capture the tension between order and chaos, control and uncertainty. For modern readers, these monotonous documents offer a window into the daily workings of empire, far from battles or grand declarations. They remind us that vast historical changes often hinge on repetitive, uncelebrated labor behind the scenes. As you reflect on this, consider, how do the quiet, bureaucratic routines of empire shape the course of history? What might be lost or hidden in such dull records? And how does this understanding change the way we view colonial power and its legacy? The Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BCE to 220 CE, is often remembered for its vast territorial expansion and consolidation of imperial power. Yet behind this grand narrative lies an intricate system of record-keeping and administration that was crucial for maintaining control over a sprawling empire. At the heart of Han governance were the countless ledger books, maintained by scribes and officials across provinces and districts. These ledgers documented everything from tax collection and land ownership to military conscription and grain storage. The records were detailed and repetitive, reflecting a bureaucratic culture that prized order and meticulousness, unlike earlier periods where local authorities held more autonomy. The Han emperors sought to centralize power by standardizing administrative procedures. The ledger books were tools to enforce imperial policy, allocate resources, and monitor population movements. The process of compiling and updating these ledgers was painstaking. Officials conducted periodic censuses and land surveys, traveling through villages and towns to verify information. This slow, methodical work ensured that imperial edicts translated into practical governance. Despite its importance, the record-keeping system faced challenges. Vast distances, local resistance, and occasional corruption hindered accuracy. Moreover, the repetitive nature of the task could lead to bureaucratic fatigue and errors. Nonetheless, these ledger books have left historians a rich source of data, illuminating the social and economic life of early imperial China. As you ponder the relentless record-keeping of the Han bureaucracy, ask yourself, how did such detailed administrative routines support the vast empire? What tensions arose between central authority and local realities? And what does this repetitive documentation reveal about the nature of early Chinese imperial power? The Han dynasty's extensive ledger system was not merely a dry exercise in documentation. It was a demanding daily reality for countless officials and scribes, whose repetitive tasks formed the backbone of imperial administration. These men, often stationed far from the capital, bore the responsibility of maintaining accurate records, essential for tax collection, conscription, and resource management. Officials embarked on regular inspections, sometimes traveling long distances to verify census data and land holdings. Their work involved cross-referencing previous records, conducting interviews with local inhabitants, and updating ledgers to reflect births, deaths, marriages, and changes in property. The repetitive nature of these duties could lead to bureaucratic fatigue, errors, and occasional manipulation. Local officials sometimes inflated population numbers or concealed assets to curry favor or evade imperial taxes. Corruption was a persistent challenge, complicating the task of maintaining reliable data. Yet the system also offered opportunities for social mobility. Skilled scribes and administrators could rise through the ranks, gaining influence and prestige by demonstrating diligence in record-keeping. The Han administrative approach balanced central control with local adaptation. While emperors mandated standardized procedures, officials on the ground negotiated the realities of diverse regions, negotiating between imperial expectations and local customs. Through these repetitive but essential bureaucratic tasks, Han Dynasty maintained its vast territories, allowing for coordinated tax revenue, military recruitment, and infrastructure projects. As you reflect on the daily lives of these bureaucrats, consider, how did their repetitive labor shape the empire's stability? What conflicts emerged between central authority and local practice? And how might this record-keeping have influenced the relationship between rulers and the ruled? The repetitive, detailed ledger-keeping of the Han Dynasty bureaucracy was more than an administrative necessity. It was a vital mechanism that sustained one of the earliest and most influential imperial systems in world history. Through these endless records, the empire could mobilize resources, govern diverse populations, and maintain internal order across vast distances. While the monotony of record-keeping may seem tedious, it reflected a deeper commitment to order, predictability, and control. The Han emperors understood that power was not merely wielded through military might or grand proclamations, but through the quiet, methodical accumulation and management of information. These ledgers also served as a legal and social framework, formalizing relationships between the state and its subjects. They documented obligations and rights, setting precedents for governance in later Chinese dynasties and influencing bureaucratic practices worldwide. Yet the system's success depended on the labor of countless individuals, often anonymous and repetitive, whose work underpinned imperial stability. Their meticulous entries allowed the Han state to adapt and endure, even amid regional diversity and occasional unrest. As you contemplate the vast empire held together by these unending ledger books, consider this: how does the repetitive work of bureaucracy shape history in subtle but profound ways? In what ways do the quiet acts of recording and administration define power? And how do these ancient practices resonate in our modern systems of governance?